I thank you for coming along with me as we continue to plod through the Gospel according to Matthew. We are in Matthew chapter 22. I will be reading verses 15 to 22, and I will be reading out of what is called the Good Speed New Testament. In this case, it's found in a larger Bible called the American Translation. The first portion of it is the Old Testament, of course, and it is translated in this translation by a number of scholars. Goodspeed's translation of the New Testament, chapter 22 and verses 15 to 22. Then the Pharisees went and made a plot to entrap him in an argument. So they sent their disciples to him with the Herodians to say to him, Master, we know that you tell the truth and teach the way of God with sincerity, regardless of the consequences, for you are impartial. So give us your opinion. Is it right to pay the poll tax to the emperor or not? But he saw their malice and said, Why'd you put me to such a test, you hypocrites? Show me the poll tax coin. And they brought him a denarius and he said to them, Whose head and title is on it? This? Whose head and title is this? They answered, the emperor's. Then he said to them, Then pay the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and pay God what belongs to God. And when they heard it, they were amazed, and they went away and left him. The Christian is called to live in two worlds at the same time. Now, if you think about it, the far easier option is to live in one world at a time. There are many who reject the faith for this reason. These people realize how difficult it is to live in this world. They know what it takes to navigate through life. To come to faith and live for the faith brings another level of complexity to this life. This is why so many in the church are practicing practical pagans. To truly embrace the faith is going to require learning how to appropriately balance the competing claims in one's life. You see, it is far easier in some ways to ignore the claims of eternity and live for self here and now. So when we say that people in the church are practical pagans, what do we mean? Sunday they'll be there praising the Lord, giving their time and saying, Great to see you, brother, what so and sister so and so at church. And Monday to Friday, they live in the world as if the church does not exist. I'm not saying that they're debauched and immoral, but their lifestyle and values is clearly centered in the world. The church does not impact their life, lifestyle, and work. In that sense, they are practical pagans. Is it possible to live simply for the faith? Is it possible to completely forsake this life and live for God alone? Now, if you use the history of the Christian monastic movement as an example, the answer would be no. Now, let me take a very complex and extensive issue and give you an ultra simplified answer and say that what the early monastic movement, say the fourth through the fifth, maybe even into the sixth century, but especially within that era, discovered is the monastic movement arises in an era when the Roman Empire was moving towards official Christendom. In other words, the foundation of the medieval structure of the church and state as more or less one entity. You know, the church as a governing influence was in place. And the result was that the church was becoming, well, corrupt, debased. And so in the fourth and fifth century, you have the rise of the monastic movement. And some of this was an attempt to get away from the corruption of the world and the corruption of that world which was seeping into the church. And people took off, well, classically expressed in the deserts and wilderness of the area around Egypt. what they were trying to do was escape from the world so that they could simply live for the faith. And we would have to say it was largely unsuccessful. That to go and try and live by yourself for the faith didn't really work. And so when you look at the history of the monastic movement, and this especially is true and what emerges in the post classical age in Europe, say 6th, 7th century, is a monastic movement that is centered on community. Instead of individuals seeking God in the desert and leaving the world behind, you have communities that come together where they are collectively working to individually experience an appropriate God, but the community allows them to work together to supply their basic needs: food, shelter, clothing, and provide a place and group in which to worship with. You see, in other words, when you look at it, it is impossible to completely forsake this world and seek to live for God and the faith only. What these communities did was make the search for God and the life of faith a cooperative venture, and that was right and appropriate. The question that the religious leaders posed to Jesus about paying taxes ultimately works off of a phony sense of spirituality. Now, a phony sense of spirituality will always find a place in the church. It does so because it sounds so sincere and genuine. I do not know about you, but I am in no way nostalgic for pit toilets, and rather kind of enamored with and like the idea of a modern sewage plant down the road that keeps my air from being stinky and my water from being disease ridden. I understand that in modern cities, a public transit system is not just a luxury, but a way to deal with congestion and air pollution. The point is that even though I live for eternity, I do so in the here and now. There is no way I can in this life create a religious life free from the responsibilities of living in this world. The life of faith is not a call to disengage from this world. Not in that sense, no. The division of the church into the laity and clergies is at times not the best of things, but it does respect to reality. In a way, one of the problems with the clergy is that they do not always appreciate the role of the laity in furthering the work of the church. It is the laity that goes out into the world. It is the laity that can take the workplace and use it as a platform to impact the world for Christ. I'm not saying you go there to preach and teach the Bible. I'm saying by living out the faith and bringing your faith values to bear on your work situation, you are bringing the reality of the faith to the greater world. This is why consistent Christian teaching recognizes the value of work and Christian service in the workplace. There is not a place that is more spiritual to be Christian. The Christian can take Jesus into his or her world. And in fact, if they are to be a disciple of Jesus, they must do that. The church and the gospel is the ultimate portable accessory. Jesus, in saying paying taxes to Caesar, slew the beast of phony spirituality and the idea that there is a place or time that is more spiritual.